That's the panicked voice of Mariam Chowdhury. She's trapped in her 8th floor flat. The corridor is filled with smoke.
We could see the fire was getting worse and the smoke was heavier. I instantly could, feel it in my eyes and in my throat.
A firefighter has entered her flat. She's saying she'll take them to safety, but there's a problem.
She just turned around and said, "Actually, just wait, I'm going to come back for you." And at that moment, it was almost flashbacks of Grenfell. I literally did think, this is it.
A burning tower block might make any of us think of Grenfell. But when the fire broke out on May the 7th, it was especially traumatic for Mariam. She knew her building is partly wrapped in the same dangerous cladding. In fact, as a leaseholder, she's been waiting almost 4 years for the work needed to make her home safe. But across England and Wales, millions of people live in leasehold flats, and it's not just cladding that's causing many of them sleepless nights. Some issues faced by leaseholders are well known, but scratch the surface and there are even more.
The smoke alarm inside my flat went off, so that's actually what got me out of bed.
The fire in Mariam's building began in a neighbouring flat a little before 9 a.m. The residents believe it was a fuse box, although the cause is still being investigated. However the fire started, it quickly took hold.
I opened the door and was just hit with this dense, solid black ball of smoke. So I just quickly shut the door, ran to wake up my friend and just let her know that, we need to get out of here. So we ran to the balcony. My neighbour was also on her balcony and she just told us, to aid your breathing, just go get a wet towel and hold that over your mouth.
Most of us would be frightened to be in a burning building, but the residents of New Providence Wharf had more reasons than most to be scared. Their complex has other fire safety issues as well as the cladding. Because it's unsafe, residents had been jointly paying £47,000 a month for a waking watch to alert them if a fire started. But that morning, it was the community WhatsApp group that told Mariam and her flatmate what was actually going on.
Luckily, I had my phone with me and, there was someone asking, is there anyone still inside? And so I'm like, yes, we're still here. Please, send help.
Firefighters were on the scene within minutes, but the rescue operation wasn't straightforward.
I was running back and forth between the balcony and the door and just banging really hard on my front door because I could hear voices. A fire lady came in. She gave us breathing masks. She told us to crawl out behind her. As soon as she opened the door, though, I could see the fire was getting worse and the smoke was heavier, and she just turned around and said, "Actually, just wait, I'm going to come back for you." And at that moment, it was almost flashbacks of Grenfell when, people were told to wait and to stay in. So you have all sorts running through your head, and I was like, is this the moment that I call my mum and dad and say something? Do I, is this... Yeah, it was quite upsetting.
Residents below watched in horror as the fire started to spread.
The second flat's caught. It's just smoking up. Yeah, the balcony above's caught fire.
About 20 minutes later, probably the longest 20 minutes of my life, finally some firefighters came in and they put the masks back on us and just said, "Don't let go of us, hold on as tight as you can." And then they guided us out of the flat and down the stairs. So yeah, it was quite scary because I literally did think, this is it. I thought to call my parents. I messaged a few of my friends. Pray for me, guys. I don't know if I'm going to make it out. I actually just made a couple of videos because I just thought if I don't make it out here, I want at least people to see what happened.
Help! Open the door! It's open!
These videos are hard to watch. The two women are clearly terrified, clearly in fear for their lives. But fortunately, this wasn't another Grenfell Tower, and every resident escaped or was rescued. Weeks later, Mariam still lives in a nearby hotel as she searches for somewhere she can stay while her home is repaired. She's also searching for answers.
I think what's upsetting is, there was no central audible alarm. The fire doors didn't close. If my own smoke alarm wasn't working, I'd still be in bed. There'd be no way I would realize until maybe it was far too late. So yeah, it's upsetting. We're also paying, for a waking watch.
Another thing upsetting Mariam is that the potentially dangerous cladding on the building was revealed just a short time after the Grenfell tragedy of 2017. But by the time of last month's fire, almost 4 years had passed since then, and yet work still hadn't started to make the building safe. And as leaseholders, the residents can't act alone. They're in the hands of their freeholder, Ballymore, which is also the company that built New Providence Wharf. The leaseholders have been locked in a dispute with Ballymore over who should meet the cost of fixing the fire safety issues. They're in the news now because of the fire, but New Providence Wharf is not unique. Leaseholders across the country have waited years to find out when their buildings will be made safe and who will pay.
This is a huge fundamental issue for a lot of people, and it needs to be resolved. It seems to just come down to money, which is really unfortunate. It's almost like we're, putting a price tag on people's lives.
Ballymore says the Waking Watch successfully alerted a significant number of residents on multiple floors. It says the complex has a silent fire alarm system linked to a control centre, which contacted the fire brigade, who were then on the site within 10 minutes. They believe the fire doors worked because there was no internal spread. And it says there's no evidence that the ACM cladding played a role in spreading the fire. The London Fire Brigade hasn't finished its investigation, so we can't know what did and didn't go wrong that morning. Part of the government's response to Grenfell was the Fire Safety Act 2021, which recently passed into law within England and Wales. It was designed to ensure that people feel safe in their homes and a tragedy like the Grenfell Tower never happens again, by making building owners more accountable for complying with safety guidelines. But it didn't protect leaseholders from paying a substantial share of the cost of making the buildings safe. Although the government has set aside significant amounts of money to help cover the cost of removing dangerous cladding, it's only for buildings over 18 metres high. That's about 6 stories. And whatever the height of the building, there's often other fire safety work that needs to be carried out, like removing the wooden balconies from New Providence Wharf. That extra work is not covered by the government's ring-fenced cash, leaving many leaseholders facing financial worries on top of their safety concerns.
We found out the Tuesday before the fire that total cost is 11.6 million now, of which 8 million is covered by the government.
This is Natalie Carter. She runs communications for the Residents Association at New Providence Wharf. It's almost a full-time job because the leaseholders have been pressuring Ballymore to pay for the rest of the work not covered by the government's cladding fund. I spoke to her just after the fire.
They only do the ACM cladding, not the timber balconies that you can see, and Ballymore is still only 500k, so the leaseholders here have to pick up the bill for 3.1 million.
Why does Ballymore say it's only going to put in $500,000?
They think that's generous, and they told us that when they presented the costs and plan to us. They said that they are under no legal obligation to contribute anything whatsoever.
Ballymore now says it's set aside £20 million to carry out the work that's needed across all its London buildings. It says this has nothing to do with the fire and the surge of bad publicity. In fact, it says it had already set aside £15 million by February. So why did it take so long to start the work? A spokesperson for Ballymore told us that New Providence Wharf is highly complex as a development and that the remedial works aren't straightforward, requiring planning consent, design and funding. They also say that the government funds were confirmed in March this year and that enabling work had begun before the fire, with remedial works commencing a few days after. But a spokesperson for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government told us it was deeply disappointing that Ballymore took so long to start work, especially once the government had promised £8 million towards the cost.
I can honestly say, when this work is done, I sell, I get out, and I will never be a leaseholder again. You've got absolutely no rights whatsoever.
Natalie, Mariam and the other New Providence Wharf leaseholders still don't know if they'll need to pay for any of the work. Ballymore has said it will endeavour to cover the cost between the government's contribution and their own, but they haven't guaranteed that. See, that's the thing. There's no legal obligation. Freeholders have been told by the government that they have a moral imperative not to pass the remaining remediation costs on to leaseholders, but they can do so unless, like Ballymore, they decide not to. That's arguably fair. Not all freeholders are also the developers, so they might feel no more responsible for fire safety issues than the leaseholders, and not all freeholders can raise the money that's needed. Meanwhile, Mariam faces a long wait before she can return to her home, and it could be even longer before she recovers from her ordeal.
I think it's finally perhaps hitting me. I think I realised all of a sudden, actually, I'm not going to be okay. The next step is probably to get some trauma counselling and try to work through this and process it all.
The cladding crisis has shone a light on how little power leaseholders have over the safety of the buildings they live in, under a system that is, in fact, a feudal relic. Here's Communities Secretary Robert Jenrick speaking in Parliament about the government's planned reforms.
Today, I will be launching the Common Hold Council, which also paves the way for homeowners to take greater control of their home through a collective form of home ownership, unusual in this country but ubiquitous in others around the world. Another vital step towards people enjoying their homes as homeowners in the truest sense of the word.
The Common Hold Council he mentioned there is really key to the government's planned reforms. It's a system where the buyers own the freehold of their own flats and then the communal areas are jointly owned. It has its difficulties. The residents have to work together to organise and pay for insurance and repairs. But it's the system that operates almost everywhere else in the world, including in Scotland. It comes after years of dogged campaigning by leaseholder groups. But there are still questions about whether these changes go far enough and whether they're happening fast enough to help the leaseholders who are in real trouble now. Government reforms will target some of the most obvious issues hitting leaseholders, but there's growing concern that other reforms could be storing up whole new problems. The country has a housing crisis. England alone needs to build 345,000 new homes a year to keep up with demand. It's falling far short. So last year, the government introduced new permitted development rules in England that mean in some circumstances, the owners of blocks of flats can build an extra 2 storeys on top without the need for standard planning permission. They still need prior approval, but there are far fewer reasons for people to be able to object, including the people who already live in the building. Can you give me the tour?
Okay, right. We'll start from the front door. When the builder moved the water tanks up above, all of this area got drowned and flooded with water, a lot of water. Water damage all here. Bedroom is the same with the 2 windows.
This is Pauline showing me around their flat with her husband Tony. Once this property was on the top floor of a small block of leasehold flats in Ealing, London. Then their freeholder, Paramveer Bhatti, through his company Apex Ealing Development Limited, built a further 5 flats on top. He did it before the rules changed, so he had to get planning permission, and this kind of development is now going to get a whole lot easier. But the residents say their building is a cautionary tale for what can go wrong when the owner develops upwards.
There was continual problems with the build. There was excessive noise 7 days of the week. Everything fell out of the cupboards in the kitchen with the excessive vibration upstairs. There was a lot of electricity power cuts during the time. They had a massive flood in here, causing a lot of this damage.
Just patches and patches and patches of damp and peeling paint and a strong smell of damp.
Yes, the surveyor had said it'll take months to get the dampness out of this flat. It appears the balconies they put up above, they didn't put any proper drainage. It appears when it rains that the water goes into the cavity wall. The plaster was coming away from the wall at the top here on both bedrooms. We have had builders in the last 6 weeks, and they said all the external walls of this flat needs taken back to the brickwork and replastered and all work's done.
Listen to that. A short time after we met Pauline and Tony, there was another flood with water cascading into the communal landing and back into the flat that they had been working so hard to dry out. But it isn't just Pauline and Tony. Other Apex Court leaseholders are worried. There's the ongoing flooding. They've seen cracks in the building walls, and several pieces of cladding have actually fallen off the new flats. In fact, they were so worried that they commissioned a surveyor of their own to inspect the work. His report was damning. I'm just looking at the summary of the surveyor's report, and you can see why the residents here are alarmed, even without the flooding and the cladding falling off. It says, no evidence of fire compartmentation is visible to the services void below all flats. Significant and visible evidence of poor workmanship. Manufacturers have confirmed the new cladding isn't installed correctly. And I think the most shocking bit is this. The developer had failed to divert services at the existing roof level. The result was reportable incidents regarding waste flue gases that could have resulted in the carbon monoxide poisoning of the lessees at Flat 7 and 3 other flats.
We who have done nothing wrong have been left with this. We've got about 40% off the price, if we can even sell it at auction. And I feel I've worked long enough hours that should not be taken from me for somebody else's greed, and that's what it is, greed.
So can we go through to your balcony?
Yes, of course. Come on out.
Thank you very much. Oh, there is a lovely cat dozing in the sun, looking very pleased with himself.
Dozy's the word. Hi.
Oh, this is lovely.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to actually have this space, you know, somewhere like London.
This is Jane. She's on the ground floor, and we talk on her sun terrace next to a very grumpy cat.
I'm one of the lucky ones in that my flat hasn't been directly affected yet. Sooner or later, it's going to get to me too. So it was really important that we joined together as a collective, just to offer each other some advice and support, because I'm lying awake at night with my stomach in knots, thinking, I cannot afford the enormous sums of money it's going to cost to fix this building, and I don't think anybody else can either. And also, why should we, for something that we had no part of? We had no problem with somebody buying the freehold and building flats, no problem at all. It was a bit awkward, you know, the place was turned into a tip for a while, but, you know, fine, fair dues. But then it's just been nothing but problems.
Even though Jane is too far down to suffer from the flooding and the damp, the new development could still have a significant impact on her finances. She's not just worried about the building, she's worried about what she might end up having to pay. After all, repairs to the building can be billed to leaseholders, as the cladding scandal shows. The residents of Apex Court are worried that they could end up having to pay to fix the block, while the freeholder pockets the profits from the new development.
We're really, really scared that these enormous repairs are going to somehow leak through on the service charges, and then we will have to fight every single one, and it's going to be exhausting. And we've got jobs and lives. We can't give up. If we just gave up and stopped doing anything, then I've had my flat valued, and the estate agent said, well, if this business isn't sorted out, you can knock at least 50,000 off it. So if we stopped fighting, it would be like this giant sword of Damocles over our head. So we can't stop.
Under the new permitted development laws, it will be easier for more freeholders to add new stories to properties like this one. But there's been no change to the laws to help leaseholders protect their homes from bad building work. Here's Baroness Andrews, a lifelong Labour peer and a leaseholder herself.
This is a really particularly toxic piece of development because it allows developers and freeholders to build upwards while minimising the ability of the leaseholders and residents to prevent that or to be compensated for the impact of these upward extensions. It short-circuits the planning system, and you can't make the full objections and the appeals and so on that you can if you have to go through the full planning system. So your rights are significantly reduced.
We should say that Baroness Andrews has skin in this game. Her freeholder is currently trying to use the new permitted development rules to build a further 2 stories on top of the building she lives in. It's hard to be sure how many more homes might be built through extending upwards. The government thinks hundreds a year, but some developer reports speculate it could mean hundreds of thousands of new properties. And we do need more houses. So is this just a new form of NIMBYism, not on my rooftop?
I think there is such a thing as NIMBYism, but in this case, actually, there's a huge impact, a real physical and probably a mental impact as well, on the people who have to live with this, and we will get no benefit from it whatsoever. What will happen, in fact, if it were to happen, we'll have 2 years of disruption without any compensation, without any provision being made for our safety or future security.
The leaseholders at Apex Court certainly told me there was not enough provision made for the safety of their homes. They say the freeholder's insurance that they have to pay for was invalidated because he didn't declare the new development. The residents now face a lengthy and potentially expensive legal battle to get the building put right. We asked Mr. Bhatti, the freeholder, about the leaseholders' complaints, but he didn't respond. The builder he used, Tresara Consultants UK Limited, did provide a statement. The company says it's engaged with residents, investigated the issues raised, and says it's satisfied that it's taken all reasonable steps to address any complaints. It says it's still in discussion with residents, so it's not appropriate to comment further. It's a very different situation to the flats in New Providence Wharf. But Martin Boyd, chair of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, a campaigning charity, thinks the same fault line runs through both cases.
We have this odd situation in the leasehold world that when it comes to the benefits, the landlord is always deemed to be the owner of the building. When it comes to the costs, those are always the liability of the leaseholders.
Many rooftop development companies say that new stories can be built in a way that minimises disruption to leaseholders and even maximises benefits to them with new facilities and redecorated stairwells. But even then, some property experts are worried that giving freeholders the right to develop their buildings' roof spaces could have another significant impact on residents.
The windfall for the landlords comes at 2 levels. Obviously, if they develop the property, there is the windfall gain from being able to sell additional flats. But even if the landlord doesn't develop the property, there is potential gain from them because they can assert that the freehold value of the site has increased because it has this permitted development right to add these additional properties at some point in the future.
He's concerned that if leaseholders come together to buy out the freehold and form common holds, then it could suddenly cost more, a lot more. The Leasehold Knowledge Partnership has analysed the government's impact assessment and believes the new development rights could increase the value of those freeholds by between 21 and almost 42 billion pounds. That's quite a potential windfall for the freeholders. The government knows this could be an issue and says that in the future, leaseholders could limit the amount they have to pay to buy out the freeholder by agreeing to not develop the building themselves. But that doesn't help leaseholders now. Meanwhile, Pauline, Jane and other leaseholders at Apex Court have been left with homes that are damaged, devalued and their concerns downplayed.
For me, it's been extremely stressful. It's been extremely stressful. I had actually like a panic attack about it because I didn't know what was next on the horizon. I find the injustice in it, that people are benefiting from the despair of the leaseholders. I don't think that's fair, and I can't believe it's happened in 2021 in England. I just can't believe it's happening.
But what if your freeholder wasn't a developer or a business? Many former social housing flats were sold on as leasehold, meaning it's the council that's the landlord. So, no big freeholders pursuing profits. That sounds like it should be much better for the buyers. Not necessarily. So you get a letter through your door. You open it. What did it say?
It said that they were going to charge me £107,000.
£107,000. Can you afford that?
No, nobody can afford that. Nobody can afford that.
This is Kirsten Lowe, a social worker and mum to toddler John, living in a leasehold flat in Haringey.
It's a yummy cream cheese sandwich. Is it very tasty? Yeah, big chomps. It's okay, you can have blueberries in a minute. Would you like me to hold your bag?
It's a flat that definitely needs work. I'm so lucky we had this space during the lockdown. I bet it made such a difference. Yeah. She gave me a tour of her garden to look at a very old wooden structure bolted onto the back of her building.
So we're looking at a 2-storey
prefabricated pod bathroom. I'd say it's about sort of 6 foot by 10 foot, and it's our bathrooms. The one at the bottom is for the flat downstairs, and the top story is for my flat, because when they first built the flats, they didn't have bathrooms inside. They had like a bathtub that they had in the kitchen that they would fill up, and toilets outside. So in the 1970s, when the council bought all of the estate, they decided that the way to sort of fix the problem was to put these bathrooms on the back. And now, as you can see, they're made from sort of timber. They've got asbestos inside them. They're rotting.
Kirsten knows the work needs to be done to replace the pods, and she accepts that the leaseholders are responsible for the cost. But she says her freeholder, Haringey Council, has decided to lump together a lot of other work that hasn't been done over the years. A lot of other work. The estimated cost has now risen to 108 grand.
To take the old prefabricated pod off and put in a new prefabricated pod, that was going to cost about £97,000 for both stories. But then they were going to do the windows for £16,000, do the roof and the doors as well, the front door, which they say is going to cost £2,000 to replace a timber front door.
£2,000 just for the front door?
Yes. For it to now cost £100,000 is just crazy. And then to do all the works on top at the same time, it is a lot.
You might question whether Kirsten should have done more to understand what buying a leasehold meant and what might happen. But Kirsten says there's simply no choice.
I think I was really stupid to have bought a leasehold property. There was no alternative. If you're sort of in your 20s living in London, you can't afford to buy a house. It's that or you leave London. And I think a lot of people, especially living in cities, would be forced to buy leasehold properties because it's that or not buy and just continue to rent.
The Haringey flats are full of character. They're historic red brick homes, 2 flats to each block, with arches over the front doors. The streets are well spaced with an outstanding school close by, and Kirsten and her neighbour Charlie Ginn clearly both love their homes.
Oh, welcome, come in.
Oh, this is lovely.
I know, it's super nice, isn't it?
It's super nice. I love the colour scheme.
And I feel like they're just going to suck all life out of it. Like the lovely windows.
It's beautiful. It's got so much character as well. Like you've really put your own stamp on it.
Of course, this was our first home. Our first home is where we had our little girl. Like, this is our first family home together.
Charlie's flat is decorated in bright, cheerful colours, and it's immaculately maintained on the inside. So she's frustrated. She thinks that if the parts of the building the freeholder is responsible for had been properly maintained, then a lot of the major work she's about to be billed for wouldn't need to be done now.
So we have to undo these little screws.
They're lovely windows, but yeah, you can see they've not been maintained.
Oh yeah, of course. Look, you can see my lovely windowsill all painted, as I do every year, and then you can see their windowsill rotting, falling apart. As part of our lease, we are not allowed to do any work to the property without having permission from the council. So we're responsible for the interior, like the interior of the windows. The council are responsible for the exterior. They are meant to paint the exterior every 5 years. So we've been here 7 years. They haven't done anything. We requested a list of all the works they've done in the last 20 years, and they've done nothing to our property.
So do you feel like they should have been doing work on an ongoing basis and suddenly the music stops and you get the bill?
100%, 100%. Because our lovely windows, you know, if they are painted every 5 years and they are looked after, they wouldn't be rotting now.
Like Kirsten, Charlie also faces a big bill, though not quite as staggering. She was told £60,000, and that's since been reduced to £30,000. But even the smaller amount has derailed her plans.
We've actually now had to take our flat off the market. We've had a couple of offers, they've all fallen through. We had one person who was quite happy with the bill because, you know, you're able to get new windows, new roofs. She had a mortgage in principle for the extra amount of money. She had her survey and then the bank said it was unmortgageable. Obviously, that's fallen through. So we officially can't sell.
I mean, how do you feel knowing that a bank has said your property's unmortgageable?
Oh, I'm stuck. We're stuck here, aren't we?
They're stuck, just like the residents at Apex Court and New Providence Wharf feel stuck. But Martin Boyd from the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership says this issue is one that's much more common when it's a council that's the freeholder.
In the social sector, they have a particular problem in that they very often don't collect long-term funds. In the private sector, most sites will have something called a reserve fund or a sinking fund where you collect towards future maintenance. Everyone knows that at some point the roof is going to wear out, you'll have to replace it. So rather than sort of collecting all the money in 1 year, you might collect it over a 5 or 6 year period. But in the social sector, they don't do that. They just send people out the bill for the whole piece of work. And if in many instances when they combine projects together, because for the social landlord, it's advantageous to them if they do all of the works in one go, there are huge costs generated.
This has hit these leaseholders hard. Charlie's life is on hold. Her flat can't sell until the work is finished, but Kirsten's at risk of losing her home.
I think the likely outcome is to have to give it up, to pay it, because we don't know exactly what the payment options will be in terms of staggering out the payments. I don't think it's going to be affordable on top of the mortgage payments that we're paying at the moment. We're going to have to give it up. And I imagine because it's going to wipe out the deposit, that's going to mean that it's sort of back to private renting, really. So
Charlie and Kirsten had no say over the delays that pushed up the costs and no control over the extent of the works. I asked Martin Boyd what protection there is for leaseholders in cases like this.
The reality is that for most people, your ability to challenge is extremely limited. You could, in theory, challenge that the landlord had failed to properly maintain the building over a long period of time, but that is so difficult to do. You would need to employ a set of experts that could somehow prove that the landlord had been grossly unreasonable. And you always have the difficulty that they would turn up and say, we just couldn't fix it because the government wouldn't give us any money.
At the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, have you seen anyone lose their home because they couldn't afford the bill for work that needed to be done?
Yes, unfortunately, we've seen a number of people lose their home.
Charlie feels she only really understands how leasehold works now she's seen the risks firsthand.
We don't own our flats. You don't have any say in what we thought was our home.
Would you buy a leasehold again?
Oh my gosh, no, absolutely not. I've definitely learned from my mistakes. I'm telling everyone I know, don't buy a leasehold. I'm spreading the word. Don't do it. It's a swizz. It really is.
So what does the council say about the difficulties its works leave the leaseholders in? Well, they're proposing to cap the cost of the pods to £25,000 each, which would cut Kirsten's bill to around £80,000. 80 grand may be better than 108, but Kirsten says it's still unaffordable and she still faces losing her home. The incoming leader of Haringey Council, Peri Ahmed, also says she's looking at the other concerns with fresh eyes. So perhaps there's hope for Kirsten that the council might do more to help her afford to keep her home. But it doesn't resolve anything for Charlie, who's still in limbo until the work is complete and she can sell. 3 different properties, 3 different problems, one unavoidable truth, that in England and Wales, a freeholder's actions can have a significant impact on the lives and finances of leaseholders. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government is making ambitious reforms to leasehold. It says they will be some of the biggest changes in 40 years. But those promised reforms do little now to help leaseholders like Kirsten, who fear they could lose their homes, or like Jane and Pauline, who are scared they will have to pay for substantial repairs because of work done to create profits for someone else. What could the government do to fix all these problems? What would you do if you were suddenly in charge tomorrow?
I think the most useful thing that the government is doing is proposing to look at common hold again, and then we would have the same sort of legal structure that almost every other country uses. The people living in the building collectively own the building. They have an interest in looking after the building and making sure it works well.
Isn't the problem there the huge cost of shifting to a different system? I mean, the government, they couldn't buy out all the freeholders, could they?
No, leaseholders will have to buy out their share of the freehold, and it will all depend at what price that's fixed. and it then allows you to get into a very different environment to that we have in the leasehold system.
After centuries of leasehold, the reforms will be welcomed by campaigners, but they won't help the people we've spoken to. People who discovered too late how little control they have over the homes they believed they owned.
So I'm just heading back to my flat, and the hallways are completely black. The smell is really overwhelming, and it just brings back a lot of memories of that day.
Remember Mariam Chowdhury, who we met at the start of this programme? It's 3 weeks since she was rescued by firefighters from her 8th floor flat. She's still living in her hotel room, still trying to find temporary accommodation, and she's still very worried about what the future might hold.
Let's get into the flat. The footprints of the firemen everywhere on the rugs and just ash on the floors. Apart from the overwhelming smoke smell, everything is exactly how I left it. I can still see the towel that I soaked in water to hold over my mouth to breathe. You know, you buy these flats thinking you have a home, and, you know, you don't account for all that can go wrong. You know, I was lucky I got refuge on my balcony. You know, my neighbor, he just passed out inside his flat due to smoke inhalation. Luckily, the fire brigade, you know, was able to take him out as well. It's devastating. It feels kind of scary to go back. You don't ever want to face that situation again. But we have no choice. We've bought those homes. Those flats are our homes. We can't sell them. We're just stuck.